5 cowboys held her leg and whispered, "Please marry me." But the giant bride said, "Too small for me." What broke Magnolia's heart wasn't their size. It was that after a lifetime of being called a freak, she'd finally found men who saw her as beautiful. But she was too wounded to believe she deserved it. They thought they were choosing her. But in truth, she was about to choose the one man in that valley strong enough to stand beside her, not at her feet. The sun hit her shoulders like a brand. Even standing still, she seemed to vibrate with a restrained thunder. Her black dress clung to thighs carved from decades of defiance. Dirt clung to her boots. Sweat dripped slowly down her spine, and 5 grown cowboys, each one hardened by war, by cattle drives, by a bone-deep loneliness that could swallow a man whole, knelt like children around her legs. Their eyes were wide. Their hands were trembling. "Please marry me," one of them breathed, his voice shaking like dry leaves in a hard wind. "Pick me," said another, his fingers gripping her calf like it was the last tree of life in a flooded world. "I'll build you a church with my bare hands," the third whispered, like it was a prayer he'd been saving his whole life. "We'll never hurt you, I swear," the fourth added, his voice cracking on the last word. "She's real," the fifth one said, his voice full of awe, tears catching in his thick beard. "Lord have mercy, she's real." Magnolia looked down, towering over them like a redwood in a field of daisies. Her face didn't shift, not a flicker. She'd heard every single one of those words before. In Boston, the words had been mocking, spit from the side of a rich man's mouth. In Kansas City, they were drunken, slurred in a dark alley. In New Orleans, they were desperate, cried out by a showman who wanted to put her on a stage. But here, in this dusty, forgotten place called Copperbite Valley, it was something so much worse. It was genuine. She slowly, deliberately, peeled their fingers off her leg one by one. Her touch was firm but not cruel. "You're sweet boys," she said, her voice low and heavy, like thunder that was too tired to strike. "But you're all too small for me." They blinked up at her, confusion clouding their faces. She didn't mean in stature, though that was true too. She meant in spirit. None of them had seen her rage. None of them had seen her ruin, or the ugly, bloody business of her rebuilding. They only saw a story to tame, a spectacle to claim, a dream to own. She turned and walked. The dust swirled up around her boots, a small storm of her own making. Behind her, none of them followed. Not yet. She passed the town's empty church, its steeple leaning like a tired old man. She passed the mercantile with its cracked windows staring out like blind eyes. She passed the boarded-up saloon, a place where laughter hadn't lived in years. Eyes followed her, of course. They always did, peeking through slatted shutters and cracked doors. But no one spoke. No one ever dared to speak first. She could still feel the phantom touch of the men's hands on her legs, light, trembling, reverent. And it burned. It burned not because it was wrong, but because a small, treacherous part of her, a part she thought she had killed and buried long ago, had wanted to stay. For once in her miserable life, they weren't laughing. They were asking. But Magnolia Row had learned the hard way what happened when you trusted that kind of softness. It was a trap. It was always a trap. She ducked into the abandoned barn just past the chapel, the big doors groaning in protest. She dropped her heavy duffel bag onto the dirt floor with a thud that shook the dust from the rafters. A wooden beam overhead creaked, swaying like it was sharing a secret with the spiders. Magnolia wiped the sweat from her brow and took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady the wild horse that was her heart. But it had already sprinted a mile ahead of her. The words came back, louder now in the quiet of the barn. "Please marry me. Pick me. We'll never hurt you. She's real." God, how she hated hope. It was a liar and a thief. She dropped to her knees and fumbled with the clasp on the duffel. Inside was the wreckage of her life. Her mother's wedding veil, torn and yellowed at the edges. A steel horseshoe from the last ranch that had dared to hire her, a place she'd fled in the middle of the night. A bottle of moonshine, half gone. And at the very bottom, tucked away like a sin, was a letter. The envelope was stained with sweat and time, and it had only 3 words written on it. Come home, Maggie. She hadn't touched it since the day it found her in a dusty post office in Nebraska. She hadn't needed to. The handwriting alone, sharp and cruel and perfect, had carved a canyon straight through her memory. She knew who it was from. It was from him. She risked a glance out through the slats of the barn wall. The 5 cowboys were still out there in the main street. They were standing now, brushing the dust off their knees, glancing around at each other, confused, embarrassed, maybe even a little ashamed. One of them picked up his hat from the dirt like he was waking up from a trance. None of them had a clue what they had just done. None of them could have possibly guessed what they had just triggered inside her. She closed her eyes, but it didn't help. The memories slammed back into her, sharp and fast as a whip crack. Chicago, 1867. She was 16. The foreman at the steel mill offered her extra pay if she would just stand still while his friends laughed at her arms, her shoulders, her height. They threw pennies at her feet. St. Louis, 1871. The boarding house owner gave her 1 night's stay, then posted her name under a list of circus applicants in the common room. She tore the paper down, and her own hands, big and strong, felt alien to her. Denver, 1874. The man who claimed to love her. He kissed her rough in the dark and then whispered in her ear, "You'll never be more than a headline, Maggie, a freak for folks to read about." Every single time she had opened herself up, just a crack, they had turned her into a joke. Every time she had bent, just a little, they had tried to break her. So she stopped bending. She stopped opening. She built a wall of muscle and silence around herself, and that's when the name changed. She wasn't Maggie anymore. Maggie was a girl who cried. Maggie was a girl who hoped. She became Magnolia Rowe. 6 feet, 7 inches tall, 245 pounds of don't try me. Voice like thunder, arms like pure justice. She didn't belong in cities with their narrow streets and narrower minds. She didn't belong in parlors. She belonged in the open spaces where you could scream your lungs out, and the only thing that answered back was the wind. And now, here she was, another town, another group of men on their knees, another chance to become somebody else's story. But Magnolia had finally learned how to tell her own. She stayed in that barn until the sky turned from gold to a bruised purple. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of pine and cold earth. Her hands started to shake, but not from fear. It was from something colder, something deeper. A raw, aching loneliness that was so vast it felt like a landscape inside of her. She didn't want to be a spectacle. She didn't want to be a story. She just wanted to be held, not worshipped, not feared, not begged for. Just held. The barn door creaked open. She spun around fast, her fists clenched, her body tensed, ready to fight, ready to run. But it wasn't the Cowboys. It was one man. A man she hadn't seen before. A man who hadn't knelt, who hadn't whispered. He just stood there in the doorway, tall and quiet, his arms folded across his chest, and he stared at her. Not at her size, but at her eyes, like he already knew every single reason she was hiding in the dark. His name was Fletcher Boone. He was ex-Army, ex-Wrangler, ex-husband to a woman buried up in the Elk Ridge Cemetery. The folks in town, the few that were left, called him the Whispering Mountain, because he rarely spoke. But when he did, things changed. The ground shifted under your feet. He didn't look scared of her. He didn't look desperate or awestruck. He just looked ready. Magnolia narrowed her eyes, her voice rough. "You come to offer a ring too?" He took a step forward, his boots echoing on the old wooden floor. The sound was solid. "No," he said. His voice was like gravel and honey. "Then what do you want?" Her own voice cracked, betraying her. He looked at her for a long, long time. The silence stretched until it was a living thing between them. Then, finally, he spoke. "You looked sad when you said 'too small for me.' Not angry, just sad." Magnolia swallowed hard. The truth of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Maybe I am." "You're not," Fletcher said, his voice certain. "You just ain't met someone who ain't trying to own you yet." The silence came back, but this time it felt different. "You trying to fix me, cowboy?" she asked, a bitter edge to her words. He shook his head slowly. "No, I'm just making sure you know the door ain't locked." She stared at him. The last of the dying light framed him in the doorway, turning him into a silhouette. Broad, calm, solid. He didn't reach for her. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't make a single promise. He just turned, pulled the barn door wider, and walked out into the twilight, leaving her alone with the choice. And for the first time in a very long time, Magnolia felt something deeper than fear, something more dangerous than rage. Possibility. She looked down at the letter again, at the cruel, familiar handwriting. "Come home, Maggie." But maybe home wasn't a place you ran back to. Maybe, just maybe, it was something you built, with someone who never knelt, but always stood right beside you. Magnolia didn't sleep that night. How could she? She lay on the cold barn floor, staring up at the rafters where the stars poked through the holes in the roof like shy witnesses. Her body was built like a monument, solid and unmovable, but her heart was pulsing like a raw, open wound. The 5 cowboys, she knew, had retreated to their bunkhouses or saloons, probably nursing bruised egos and pride that had been scraped raw. They were a memory already. But Fletcher Boone lingered. Not physically, not in footsteps or shadow. He lingered in the quiet. He lingered in the way he hadn't tried to impress her, in the way he hadn't reached for her leg like she was some kind of prize to be won. He hadn't whispered a single pretty lie or impossible promise. He'd just left the barn door open. Magnolia hated open doors. They always led to things she couldn't afford to want. Hope, trust, softness, all the things that had tried to kill her before. She stood up at dawn, the chill in the air biting at her skin. Her breath fogged in front of her face as she walked out into the morning, her boots crunching on the frost-bitten ground. And there he was. Fletcher. He was already by the well, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, hauling on the rope to pull up a bucket of water. He worked with a steady rhythm, like the world owed him an apology, and he was going to wring it out of the earth one bucket at a time. "You always up this early?" she asked, her voice raspy from sleep and disuse. She half hoped he wouldn't hear her. He didn't stop pulling the rope. He didn't even look at her. "You always sleep in barns?" "Only when towns feel like traps," she shot back. He finally got the bucket over the edge of the well and set it down with a soft thud. He nodded slowly, like what she'd said was the most sensible thing in the world. "You eat?" "No." "Then come on." He picked up the heavy bucket as if it weighed nothing and walked away, not even looking back to see if she was following. Against her better judgment, she followed. His house was simple. Weathered logs that had seen 100 seasons, a clean-swept porch, and a thin curl of smoke rising from the stone chimney. Inside, it smelled like bacon and black coffee, and Magnolia didn't realize just how starved she was until her stomach let out a growl so loud it made them both pause. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a small wooden table. She did, feeling clumsy and out of place. The chair felt too small, the room too quiet. The plate he handed her was chipped around the edges. The eggs were slightly burnt. The coffee was thick as mud and twice as bitter. And still, it was the best meal she'd had in years. It was real. Fletcher sat across from her, chewing slowly, watching her. But he wasn't watching her like the others did. The men who measured her with their eyes, calculating her weight, her strength, her strangeness. No, Fletcher was studying her spirit. He was looking for the cracks. "You fight bulls for fun, or you just look like you could?" he asked, his tone deadpan. She snorted, a laugh surprising her. "Only men who try to wrestle me count." He smiled, a small, sad thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. "So, what brings a woman like you to a town like this?" She hesitated, then gave him the half-truth. "Wanted quiet. Maybe a different ending than the ones I keep getting." "You running from something?" "No," she said, way too fast. The lie hung in the air between them. "Someone, then," he said. It wasn't a question. He dropped his fork, the clatter loud in the still room. He didn't flinch. He just waited. Magnolia looked down at her own hands, at the calluses and scars that told the story of her life. The truth came out of her, in a raw, ragged whisper. "I was promised to a man back in Kansas. Called himself a preacher. Said God made me big so I could bear him giants for his army. Didn't care that I had my own name. He called me Eve, like I was the first woman he'd ever laid eyes on. Said I was made for him." She picked up her coffee cup, but her hand was shaking so badly she had to set it back down. "The first night, he locked the door to my room and prayed over me while I slept. Prayed over my body like I was some kind of temple and some kind of weapon. I left before the sun came up. Took a bread knife and my mother's veil. Haven't stopped walking since." Fletcher stood up so suddenly his chair scraped against the floor. He went to the fireplace, tossed another log onto the flames, and stared into them, his back to her. Only then did he speak, his voice tight. "That why you won't let no one get close?" She finally met his eyes across the room. "Is that why you still wear your ring?" His hand instinctively went to his left ring finger. It was bare, but a pale, smooth groove was still there, a ghost of a promise. "She died," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "Fever took her and our boy. Same week." The silence that filled the room then was heavier than any mountain. It swallowed the crackle of the fire, the sound of their breathing. "I'm sorry," Magnolia whispered, and she meant it. "So am I," he said, turning to face her. His eyes were full of a pain so old and deep it looked like part of him. For her, for the child, and for not knowing how to be a husband when she needed one. I worked too much, talked too little. I thought time would wait for me." He took a step closer. "I'm not looking to replace what I lost. I'm trying to build what I didn't finish." Magnolia stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, louder than any train she'd ever boarded to escape a town. A half smirk, a familiar shield played at her lips. "You say that to all the giant women who pass through town?" "No," he said, his gaze steady and serious. "Just the one who scares 5 grown cowboys into worship." Her smile faded. "They didn't worship me. They wanted to tame me, make me a legend they could show off to their friends." He stepped even closer until he was standing right in front of her. The sheer size of her didn't seem to register with him at all. "I don't want a legend," he said, his voice dropping low. "I want a partner. Someone who will ride beside me, not behind me. Someone who will swing an axe when the barn collapses and cuss when the bread burns and not flinch when I fall apart." She had to look up at him, and her eyes shined. For once, it wasn't sweat. It was tears. "I don't know how to be someone's anything," she said, her voice cracking, the confession costing her everything. "Then we start with trying," he said. And that was the first time Magnolia Rowe let someone touch her without flinching. His hand on hers was calloused, warm, and steady. He didn't pull, he didn't clutch, he didn't try to possess. He just held. That night, she stayed in his house. Not in his bed, not in his arms, but under his roof. and the silence between them finally felt like peace, not a punishment. Before she fell into a restless sleep in the spare room, she found the letter again in her duffel. "Come home, Maggie." This time, she opened it. Inside was a single folded page, scrolled in that same crooked, cruel handwriting. But the words weren't what she remembered. They were different. Twisted. "You don't owe anyone your strength, just your obedience. You were made for a holy purpose. Come back when you're ready to be used by God, not loved by men. Your preacher is waiting." A cold dread washed over her. He hadn't sent a letter of longing. He'd sent a summons, a threat. She folded the letter and tucked it deep into the pocket of her coat. She still didn't know if she could stay in this valley. She still didn't believe in forever. But for the first time since she ran, she stopped packing her bag to leave, because running was no longer an option. Sooner or later, she was going to have to fight. 3 days passed, then 5. A strange rhythm settled between them. She helped Fletcher repair the chicken coop, her strength making the work of 3 men look easy. He showed her how to chop kindling more efficiently, a small trick of the wrist she'd never known. She taught him how to clean a fish without wasting a single scrap of meat. He made her laugh once, a loud, booming sound that surprised them both, and he looked so shocked by it that she laughed even harder. They didn't speak of the 5 cowboys, but word around town had shifted. The whispers that followed her were different now, no longer just about her size, but about her actions. "Did you hear what she lifted? That fallen oak on the miller's fence line?" "She patched old Elodie's fence in a single afternoon. That fence has been down since the war." "She works like 10 men," one man at the mercantile said, shaking his head in disbelief. And she smiled at Fletcher. "Did you see it?" Not everyone approved, of course. Mrs. Halford, the mercantile owner's wife, a woman whose face looked permanently soured, shook her head every time Magnolia passed. "She's too much for this place," she'd mutter to anyone who would listen. "Too much for any man." Fletcher heard it. He didn't respond, didn't argue. He just stood a little taller beside her and, in front of the whole town, placed his hand on the small of her back, a simple, solid gesture of ownership and protection that said more than words ever could. Magnolia didn't say thank you, but that night, she baked bread. It came out lopsided and burnt on the bottom, but Fletcher ate 2 thick slices like it was the finest cake in all of St. Louis, and she wept later when he wasn't looking, because no one had ever honored her effort before. They only ever saw her strength. The next morning she found 5 folded notes on the porch, one from each of the cowboys. They were apologetic, honest, and surprisingly poetic. They had meant no harm, they wrote. They were just struck dumb by the sight of her, by the legend of her that had preceded her arrival. One of them, the youngest, had written something that stuck with her. "I didn't want to love you. I wanted to be you, strong, free." She folded the letters and placed them in the fire, watching them curl into ash. Fletcher was right. Legends were stories for men to tell around a campfire. But homes were for women to build. Magnolia stepped outside just as the first snowflakes of the season started to fall. Not the hard, biting kind, but the soft, quiet kind that just warned of the winter to come. And that's when she saw them. From the hill overlooking the small ranch, 5 shadows were approaching. The cowboys. But this time, they weren't kneeling. They weren't begging or whispering promises. They were running. "Trouble!" one of them yelled, his voice strained with panic. "Coming from the ridge." Fletcher came out of the house beside her, a rifle already in his hand. He didn't even have to ask. "Rustlers," he muttered, his jaw tight. Magnolia cracked her knuckles, a sound like small bones breaking. "Then let's show them how giants defend a home." The wind howled through the valley, carrying the sound of approaching doom. Fletcher tossed the last rifle to one of the cowboys, a man named Jeb, then turned to Magnolia. She was already rolling up her sleeves, her boots planted firm in the frost-bitten dirt. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "How many?" she asked, her voice calm and even. "8 riders," Fletcher said, his eyes scanning the ridge. "Maybe more, coming hard. They're not just passing through." She nodded once. Then she bent down, wrapped her powerful hands around a thick fence post that marked the edge of the property, and yanked it straight out of the frozen ground like it was a stubborn carrot. "This will do," she said. The cowboys stared, their eyes wide. They remembered how easily she'd shrugged off their advances just days before. But now, with armed raiders bearing down on them, they didn't see a woman. They saw a force of nature. They saw their only chance. Fletcher handed her a heavy pistol. "You ever shoot one of these?" "I hit the preacher square in the nose once from 20 feet. Does that count?" A grim smile touched Fletcher's lips. "Close enough." They took their positions, Fletcher and 2 of the cowboys by the barn, the other 3 near the house and the tree line. The air grew tight, sharp with the metallic taste of adrenaline. The hoofbeats thundered in the distance, getting closer and closer, a storm you could taste on your tongue. One of the cowboys, a kid no older than 20, swallowed hard. "They're here." Magnolia could see them now. A ragged group of men on horseback, their faces half covered in dirty scarves, rifles raised, greed glinting in their eyes like fool's gold. Raiders. Rustlers. The kind of men who would tear through a small town like a fire, taking what they wanted and burning the rest, then vanish back into the wilderness. The leader, a big man with a cruel-looking scar across his cheek, raised his arm and shouted, his voice echoing across the small valley. "We don't want no blood, just the horses and whatever's in that barn." Fletcher stepped forward, his rifle raised and steady. "Not yours to take." A cruel laugh answered him. "Then we'll take the land too, and anyone stupid enough to stand in our way." Magnolia stepped out from behind the corner of the house to stand beside Fletcher. She held the fence post like a club, resting it on her shoulder. The raiders pulled up short. They'd heard the whispers, the stories of a giant woman in Copperbite Valley. But stories were one thing. The reality of her, standing there, taller than any of them, muscles tensed, eyes burning with a cold fire, was something else entirely. "Then come try," she said, her voice a low growl. The first rider, braver or dumber than the rest, spurred his horse forward in a warning charge, firing a shot into the air. Magnolia didn't wait. She didn't hesitate. She ran straight at him. The ground shook under her powerful steps. She met the charging horse head-on, swinging the heavy fence post like a battering ram. She didn't hit the rider, she hit the horse. The post slammed across the animal's chest, and it went down with a terrified scream. The rider was thrown clear, hitting the hard, frozen dirt with a sickening crack. He didn't get up. The second and third raiders came in together, screaming curses. Fletcher fired once, then again. The cowboys, braver now, seeing her incredible charge, opened fire. A fourth rider made it through the fence line, but Magnolia was on him in an instant. She fought without hesitation, without mercy. She knocked a rifle clean out of a man's hands with one swing of her post, the wood connecting with his arm with a sound like a branch snapping. Blood sprayed across the frost-covered ground. These raiders weren't used to this. They were used to terrorizing farmers and ranchers, people who would cower and hide. They weren't prepared for a woman who didn't scream, who didn't run. A woman who knocked you off your horse and dared you to get back up. In less than 5 minutes, it was over. 2 raiders lay unconscious on the ground. 3 were limping away on foot, their horses having bolted. The other 3 were riding away fast, 2 of them bleeding. The last one, the leader with the scar, lay groaning, pinned under his own dead horse. Magnolia walked over to him. She lifted the heavy saddlebag from beside his crushed leg. Inside she found what she expected, stolen silver, a bundle of cash, and something else, a rolled-up wanted poster. Fletcher came and looked over her shoulder. You were right. They weren't just passing through. One of the cowboys let out a string of curses. You just saved the whole valley, ma'am. Another whispered, She's not just a bride. She's a damn legend. But Magnolia wasn't listening. She was staring at the poster. Because it wasn't a poster for the Raiders. It wasn't for Fletcher. It was for someone else. Someone from her past. The preacher. His face, smug and self-righteous, was plastered across the territory lines. A bounty on his head for fraud and theft. But that wasn't what made her hands go cold as ice. It was the note, scrawled in blocky handwriting at the bottom of the poster. Last seen asking questions about a woman called Maggie the Giant, headed north. Her blood ran cold. Fletcher saw the look on her face. What is it? Nothing, she lied, folding the paper fast, her fingers clumsy. Because if he knew, if any of them knew the whole truth, it would change everything. She handed the poster off to Jeb, one of the cowboys. Make sure the sheriff in the next county sees that. But as she handed it over, her eyes caught something she'd missed. There was a second name on the poster, listed below the preacher's in smaller letters. Wanted for questioning as accomplice. Maggie Rowe. Her whole world tilted. He hadn't just been following her. He'd been setting a trap. He was making her a criminal, just like him, ensuring she had nowhere left to run. The rest of the day was a blur. Villagers, hearing the commotion, came out to help clean up the mess. The injured raiders were dragged to the town's small, empty jailhouse. The dead horse was buried. The wounded cowboys were bandaged up by the town's women. But Magnolia couldn't focus. Her body was here, mending fences and calming frightened livestock. But her mind was unraveling. That poster, that name, Maggie. And now, accomplice. He was poisoning her name, turning her into a monster in the eyes of the law, the same way he'd tried to turn her into a monster in her own eyes. She sat on the porch alone as dusk fell, her arms wrapped tight around her knees, watching the light change over the very ridge the raiders had come from. Fletcher joined her, sitting quietly beside her. He didn't speak. He just sat close enough that their shoulders brushed, a silent, solid presence. I thought I was done with running, she said, her voice so low it was almost lost to the wind. He looked at her, his face grim in the fading light. You don't have to run. Not anymore. She looked down at her hands. You don't know what's coming. I don't need to, he said simply. I know you. Tears, hot and sharp, threatened behind her eyes. No, you want to know me, that's different. He didn't flinch from her anger, from her fear. Then tell me. She shook her head, unable to speak the words, unable to confess that she was a wanted woman, that staying with her could get him killed. He leaned in slightly, his voice softer now. Magnolia, today you threw a man off a horse with your bare hands. You stood between death and a town that used to whisper behind your back, and you didn't blink. But right now, you're shaking. She turned her face away, ashamed. Because he's still out there. Who? The preacher, she whispered. The one who marked me. Who promised I was made by God just for him. Who said he'd chase me to the ends of the earth. Fletcher was silent for a long moment. Then he said the words that changed everything. You ain't his. She looked at him, startled. You ain't his, Maggie. You never were. He'd said it, Maggie, and it didn't hurt. Spoken in his voice, it didn't sound like a brand or a curse. It sounded like belonging. I'm scared, she admitted, the words feeling foreign and sharp on her tongue. I've never said that out loud before, not once in my whole life. Fletcher reached over and took her hand. His grip was firm, grounding her. We'll face him together. And for the first time since she'd fled that locked room in Kansas, she believed someone might actually mean it. That night, the valley slept safe because of her. But Magnolia didn't sleep at all. She sat by the fire long after Fletcher had gone to bed, her fingers tracing the edges of the wanted poster she had secretly retrieved from the cowboy. Wanted as accomplice. The words burned into her mind. Home wasn't a place you ran to. It was a place you defended, and she was about to have to defend this one with everything she had. It started with the sound of hooves. Not many, just one horse moving at a slow, deliberate walk. It was a few days after the raid. A fragile peace had settled over the valley. Fletcher was out behind the house, the rhythmic thud of his axe chopping wood a comforting heartbeat. Magnolia was inside, washing the floor, a habit she'd picked up from her Aunt Ruth. Clear floors make for clear minds, her aunt used to say. The fire was warm, a loaf of bread was rising on the hearth, and a stillness had settled over everything like grace. Until that sound broke it. She looked out the small kitchen window, and her blood turned to ice water in her veins. The rider was alone. A black horse, a long, dusty coat, a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. But she knew, even before he got close enough for her to see the eyes like dried blood. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. Her breath caught in her throat. Her legs began to move without her asking them to, backing away from the door, seeking the shadows of the small room. But it was too late. He was already on the porch. A knock. 2 slow, hollow raps on the wooden door. Fletcher stepped inside, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He paused, seeing the look on her face. "What's wrong?" She couldn't answer. Her tongue was a lead weight in her mouth. Another knock, slower this time, more patient, more menacing. Fletcher moved toward the door, picking up the rifle he kept propped against the wall. But she grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't!" she rasped. "He'll twist it into something. He wants a reason to act holy." Fletcher's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking from her terrified face to the door. "Is it him?" She could only nod. The door creaked open before Fletcher could stop it, and there he stood. The preacher. He was still dressed like a man of God, in clean black clothes, but his soul was anything but. The same voice that had once called her Eve, that had whispered promises of fire and brimstone over her sleeping body, now said her name like a spell he was casting. "Maggie," he drawled, a sick, sweet smile on his lips. She didn't move. She couldn't. She was frozen in time, a 16-year-old girl again in a locked room. He stepped inside as if he'd been invited, his eyes sweeping over the small, clean house, a look of disdain on his face. "You left before the Lord was done with you." Fletcher's voice came out low and dangerous, a rumbling growl. She didn't leave anything. She escaped. The preacher finally turned his attention to Fletcher, his smile widening. "And you must be the heathen, the one who thinks he can hold what God has already claimed." Magnolia's voice broke through, hard as stone. "You don't speak for God." He took a step toward her, and Fletcher instantly raised the rifle, the click of the hammer being cocked echoing in the tense silence. "One more step, and I swear to God." The preacher's smile didn't fade. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I ain't here to spill blood. I came with an offer, a one-time offer. Come back with me, Maggie. I have a new town, a new flock, a town of men who already believe in you thanks to the stories I've told. They think you're divine, a gift from God. They'll do whatever I say, and I'll tell them you were made for me, to help me build a new generation of righteous men." Magnolia's face didn't change, but inside, something vital cracked. He had followed her all this way. He had found her, even in this quiet, hidden place. Because monsters don't stay in their cages when the keys are carved from Scripture. She walked forward slowly, deliberately placing herself between him and Fletcher. And for the first time in her life, when facing him, she spoke without a single tremor in her voice. "You told me I was made wrong. You told me that God gave me this body to carry your dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was your sickness. His smile finally faded. You said I would never be more than a vessel, she continued, her voice rising with every word. But I am more. I'm a builder, I'm a protector, I'm a woman, and I don't need to bleed for your twisted vision for my life to matter. His eyes flickered with a cold, reptilian rage. You'll regret this, girl. No, she said, taking another step toward him, forcing him to take a step back. You will. Because she wasn't scared anymore. And she wasn't alone. The preacher backed away, his mask of piety gone, revealing the ugly face of a bully beneath. His threat lingered in the air like poison. You won't always have this little valley to hide behind. The law's coming for you, Maggie. I've seen to it. Fletcher stepped forward, quiet and deadly as a snake. Then we'll teach the valley to bite. The door slammed shut behind him. The silence that followed was louder and more terrifying than his footsteps had been. Magnolia felt her legs give out, and she collapsed into a chair. Fletcher was instantly there, kneeling in front of her, his hands on her knees, grounding her. You were a storm, he said, his voice full of awe. No, she whispered, looking at her own steady hands. I was the roof, finally holding. That night, the whole valley came. Word had spread like a wildfire. The preacher had come, the one Magnolia had run from, and she had stood her ground. The women brought candles and jars of preserved food. The men brought tools and lumber. Someone started building a new, stronger fence around Fletcher's land. Not for protection, for solidarity. Magnolia didn't say much. She just watched from the porch, her eyes wide, her heart full of a feeling so new and overwhelming she couldn't name it. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't pride. It was deeper than that. It was belonging. Later, when everyone had gone home and they were alone on the porch under a blanket of stars, Fletcher handed her a small, crudely carved box. She opened it slowly. Inside was a simple wooden band, a ring. It's pine, he said quietly. From the old tree by the river, the one that survived the lightning strike last spring. She blinked fast, fighting back tears. Why pine? It bends, he said, but it doesn't break. She held the ring in her palm, its warmth seeping into her skin. It felt real, more real than any diamond or gold. I'm not easy, she whispered. I still flinch. I still burn inside. He nodded. That's how I know it's real. She looked up at him, her heart in her eyes. Are you sure? Magnolia Row, he said, and his voice was shaking for the first time since she'd met him. I'm not asking you to promise me children or obedience or even tomorrow. I'm just asking if you'll try. Try with me, build with me, be beside me, for as long as we've got breath in our bodies. Her answer came out as a whisper. That's the only promise I ever wanted. He slipped the pine ring on her finger. It didn't shine or glitter, but it fit. Perfectly. The next morning, she stood on the same ridge where 5 cowboys had once clung to her legs and begged for her hand. She looked stronger now, not because of Fletcher, but because, for the first time, she wasn't holding herself back just to survive. She was standing tall, ready to stay. She was ready for the war that was coming. The preacher never came back with words. He came with fire. It was just after dawn, a week later. Magnolia had gone down to the riverbank to wash. Fletcher was out back, repairing the chicken coop that had been damaged in the raid. Birds stirred in the trees, and a peaceful quiet lay over the ranch. Nothing warned them, not the sky, not the earth. Until a roar split the morning silence. The barn. It went up in seconds. Flames clawed at the sky like orange fingers reaching for a vengeful god. Thick black smoke curled like a serpent. Fletcher ran toward it with a bucket, only to freeze in his tracks. Because standing next to the inferno were 5 men, not the cowboys, strangers. Their faces were hard and cruel. Their clothes bore no badges, only ropes, knives, and the gleam of holy vengeance in their eyes. The preacher had sent his army. Fletcher raised his rifle. A shot rang out, but it wasn't his. He dropped to one knee, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. Magnolia screamed from the river, a raw animal sound of pure rage. The world blurred, but her legs didn't fail her. They moved like thunder. She ran barefoot over the rocky ground, soaked to the bone, blood dripping from her heel, where a shard of glass had sliced it open. But she didn't stop. She didn't even blink when she reached Fletcher and lifted him with one arm, pulling him behind her as if he weighed nothing. She faced the men, and for the first time in her life, the full force of her rage was unleashed. "You came to burn me down," she said, and her voice shook the very grass beneath their feet. One man, clearly the leader, stepped forward. "You were promised to God. The preacher sent us to bring you home." "I was never his to use," she replied, her voice a low, deadly growl. They moved toward her, spreading out to surround her. She stepped forward, alone, and stood between them and the wounded Fletcher, her arms out to her sides, her feet planted wide like a mountain. "You want to drag me back to him? Then drag me." They tried. 3 men grabbed her arms, 2 tried to take her legs, but she didn't budge, not an inch, because she had carried the weight of whole town's judgment on her back before, and this time she was standing for something that loved her back. With a roar, she threw them off, sending them tumbling to the ground. Then came a shout. Hoofbeats again. But this time it wasn't a single rider. It was 5. The Cowboys. The same 5 from before, the ones who had held her leg and asked for her hand. They weren't whispering gestures now. They were warriors. They rode down the slope, yelling a battle cry, wielding pitchforks and axes, and a fury that had been carved from weeks of watching her heal their valley and their own broken spirits. The strangers turned to face this new threat, but it was too late. The Cowboys didn't fight clean. They didn't fight with honor. They fought like brothers defending their sister. It was over in minutes. The preacher's men fled, broken and bleeding. One stayed behind, coughing up blood on the ground. Magnolia knelt beside him. She didn't scream at him. She didn't curse him. She just whispered, "Tell him I'm not hiding anymore." The man looked up at her, confused and terrified. You're not going to kill me?" "I don't carry death," she said, standing up, tall and magnificent against the backdrop of the smoking barn. "I carry witness." Fletcher was pale but breathing. The fire was put out by the time the rest of the town arrived. The barn would have to be rebuilt, but the fence they had all built together still stood tall. And Magnolia's hands, when she took Fletcher's good one in hers, were no longer trembling. Weeks passed. The barn was rebuilt, bigger and stronger than before, by the hands of the entire valley. People started coming to the ranch, not just to help, but to learn. Women asked Magnolia how to build things that last. Children asked her how to lift heavy things without hurting your back. Men asked her how to kneel without losing your pride. She never preached. She just showed them, by doing. One morning, Fletcher called her out to the porch. He pointed down the road. She squinted, her hand shielding her eyes from the sun. A wagon, its axle busted, was stranded in the road. Inside were 3 women. One was heavy with child, one was shaking from a fever, and one was holding a child so small and thin it had forgotten how to cry. Magnolia didn't ask their names. She didn't ask where they came from or what trouble they were running from. She simply stepped down off the porch, walked to them, and opened her arms. "Welcome home," she said. And in that moment, she became the very thing the preacher had feared the most, a refuge, a real godsend, not from some distant heaven, but from the good, solid earth. That night, under a sky full of stars, Fletcher pulled her close. "You're not too big," he whispered into her hair. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her entire face. "You're just small enough to fit inside my heart." He looked up at her. "You ever think about those cowboys?" She chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound of contentment. Every day. He raised a brow. She leaned in closer, her lips brushing his ear. They didn't break me. They reminded me that I could still be chosen. And for the first time in her life, Magnolia Rowe didn't feel like a giant. She felt like a woman who was loved for the exact size of her soul, and that, she had finally discovered, was more than big enough. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in a love that sees beyond size, beyond pain, and beyond fear, then don't just scroll away. Subscribe now for more powerful stories that will make you cry, make you smile, and make you believe in the strength of the human spirit all over again. And before you go, tell us where in the world you're watching from. Drop your country or your city in the comments below. We want to see just how far Magnolia's strength has traveled.